The Biden administration announcing new investments to trim the cost of EVs for Americans and also build out infrastructure. Some customers, though, might be wondering if an electric vehicle is still worth it. People are finding that the low temperatures are draining EV batteries in an unanticipated rising issue. Rental firm Hertz Global will be selling around 20,000 EVs, not directly tied to what we are seeing play out with the cold weather and the impact that is having on EVs, but that is tied to demand. So let's talk about all of this. We want to bring in Karl Brauer. He's executive analyst here at iSeeCars.com to dig into this a little bit more. And Karl, let's start with the news of the day, and that's the latest out of Ford, the F-150 Lightning pickup. What's your read into that, and really what that tells us more about the broader story about EV demand and the fact that it's not living up to those initial expectations?
Yeah, I think we've reached a point in the marketplace where the early adopters, the people who really want to buy a zero emissions vehicle, there's various demographics that we're into and are interested in EVs, and they seem to have all gotten their EV. And obviously that's not a static thing. There's constant churn going on there, but it does seem like we've got to break past that segment of the population into the mainstream buyer, the average consumer. And the average consumer is going to be less concerned about or thinking about emissions or even torque and all the electric vehicle benefits. They're going to be thinking about their cost upfront, their cost ongoing while they own it, their depreciation when it's time to sell it, and after this past week, probably things like what's going to happen when it gets really cold if I'm driving one.
You know, Karl, we've talked so much about a crypto winter. Maybe we need to start talking about an EV winter as well. There's some similar characteristics in customer demand and where the production is going to shift towards as well. Is it possible that we are in an EV winter, and then who kind of emerges and what's the catalyst that gets us out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that we've hit, again, this kind of market share stabilization point. When iSeeCars did a study and we looked at the market share of EVs across the country and in cities. And what we saw was that it was growing much quicker in cities or states that had less than, say, 5% share. But states like California and Oregon and Washington that already had between 7 and 10% share didn't grow very much at all there. So I think it's much easier to get to that first 7%, 7 to 9%, than it is to get from, say, 9 to 11 or 12 or 13%. And I think that's what we're hitting right now on a national level. And that's just one element. Then you've got so many other elements too. People, considering their extreme uses, and I think that's where people are starting to see what happened in Chicago, and they think to themselves, look, you can make the argument all day long that the average person only drives 30 miles a day and that the range isn't an issue and they can all charge at home. On an average day, all those things are true. Ask Chicagoans what happens when the temperature isn't average. Ask any EV owner what happens when a friend or a relative or some emergency comes up and you've got to go 200 or 300 miles in a day instead of 30 or 40 miles in a day. And, those conditions might not be common, but we all know that Americans typically buy for their max use case. And if they think that things change from average to non-average or extreme and things fall apart, they're not going to want to buy a vehicle that has that circumstance.
Karl, talk to us a little bit more for those who maybe aren't fully familiar with the reason as to why this is happening. Why are Teslas, why are other EV vehicles struggling so much in this cold weather? Obviously tied to the batteries, but walk us through exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, in a battery situation, you've got a bunch of chemicals and they're liquid and they have to move around inside the battery from when they're discharging and you're using it to when they're recharging. And when it gets cold, most fluids don't move around as easily. And that's the most simple way to think about it is the cold weather slows down everything from the electric flow from the charger into the battery, and then it slows down the ability of the battery to flow from charge to discharge state. And since that's all been hindered by colder temperature, your ranges drop to an extreme level. And people will often say, well, cars don't get as good at gas mileage in extreme hot or cold weather. Trucks can't tow as far when they're carrying a lot of load. The F-150 Lightning's range falls off a cliff basically when you use it as a real truck. And that's all true. My response to that is always, that's right. And when you have an energy problem in an internal combustion engine, you solve it in 10 minutes. You look around, you look on your app, oh, there's a gas station, boom, 7 to 10 minutes later, you're done. That's not what happens in an EV. And I think a lot of these recent stories are starting to really illustrate that.
Well, Karl, so then if a viewer is sitting at home, they have an EV, what are some of the things, can they do anything to prevent these issues? Or I guess what's the best workaround for them in terms of how they should be approaching this, other than, I guess, charging it at every chance you get?
Yeah, you can do preconditioning. The automakers have got smarter about things. So if you've got a level 2 charger at your house and it's parked overnight and it's cold the next day, get the car warmed up before you ever unplug it. Get the car's ambient temperature and everything in the cabin up to temperature before you ever disconnect from the grid in your garage, and you aren't burning a bunch of energy when you're off the grid to get the car warmed up. So preconditioning is one thing. And again, just really thinking about where you've got to go and how far you've got to go, and take into account you might have 30+% less range when you go there. And maybe borrowing a friend's car, something like that. If you're really in an extreme weather situation like Chicago, I would reconsider other alternatives besides your EV.
Karl, some great reminders. Thanks so much for joining us here this morning on Yahoo Finance. Karl Brauer, who is the executive analyst at iSeeCars.com. Thanks.
Thank you.